first chapter, Intro to Anatomy and Physiology, goes through some terminology and some general concepts. Medical science has a long history because people had to help each other with illness and injury, and we've even seen some evidence of other species having some kind of health care, like orangutans using herbal remedies. The first serious study recorded by humans was in ancient Greece, and that's one reason a lot of our terms are in Greek. Plus, in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, universities were associated with the church, which spoke Latin. And so in the schools they spoke Latin, and a lot of our terms are Latin. If you speak Spanish or another Latin-based language, some of these terms may look familiar, though they're usually not exactly the same. Modern science, we have specific ways of studying, answering questions, and learning new things. It's called the scientific method. And it starts with making an observation, noticing something and wondering about it. Like, gee, I always seem to be kind of hyper when I drink coffee. To find out more of the thing you're wondering about from observing it, you would make a hypothesis, which is a possible explanation for the observation. You do experiments to test it, and you get some kind of data. You analyze that data and decide whether it supports the hypothesis. Whether it says, yeah, it looks like what you thought might be right, or whether it says, nope, that didn't work. So it's usually written as 5 steps: observation, hypothesis, experiment, data analysis, and conclusion. The conclusion is, does this data support my hypothesis or not? The extra thing they have over here is part of, it's kind of a bridge between your observation and your hypothesis. You go and do some side research about it, see what we already know, to make an informed hypothesis instead of just guessing. Now, this is something you can do for everyday problem solving, and maybe you already do. Let's say you get home after dark, you flip the light switch, and the light doesn't come on. That's your observation. Can someone think of a hypothesis for why the light didn't come on?
The bulb's old.
Okay, the bulb burned out. That's a hypothesis. What experiment would you do to test the hypothesis that the bulb burned out?
Put a new one in.
Put in a new bulb. And then your data would be whether the light comes on or not when you flip the switch again. If it does, your data supports your hypothesis and you're done. If it doesn't, your light still doesn't turn on, then you have to go back and come up with a new hypothesis, such as circuits blown, and go through and test that again. In everyday problems, once you get a result that supports your hypothesis, you're done. In science, they do a lot more research with bigger groups, slight variations in the question, to get more and more sure about the answers. There's actually 2 sciences that are together in this class, anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is studying the structure of the body. It comes from Greek words that mean cutting up, because that's how we found out what the structure was, by cutting into a body and looking around. Anatomy is anything that you can draw out, build a model of, label. It's the what. So shapes of bones, layers in the wall of the digestive tract, regions of the brain, things you can point to. Physiology studies the function, what the parts do. The root here, ology, we saw on the practice for connect is the study of. Physio is the same word that gives us physical, physics. It just means stuff. It's not all that helpful in understanding just what it is we're studying. So I like to spell function with a PH and it looks like physio. To remember, physiology is function. Physiology is how something works, a process. You can't really draw it except as a step-by-step kind of thing. Things like how your muscles contract, how a drug would affect heart rate, the process of digestion, functions of parts of your brain, and so on. So, questions on anatomy versus physiology? Okay. Some schools have anatomy classes and physiology classes. A lot do them together because the function of a part comes from its structure. It's often written as function follows form. On the visible scale, an example is your joints. The kind of movement you can get from it is based on how the bones fit together and how the ligaments hold them, the structure of the joints. This even works down on the chemical level. Our cells and body fluids have lots of tiny proteins called enzymes. And these are basically like little factory machines that each do one little process, a chemical reaction of some kind. And their shape is what allows them to do that particular chemical reaction instead of a different one. That leads us into levels of organization, which is basically what scale we're looking at. The smaller levels are more detailed, but sometimes it can be easier to understand something on a larger level where you can really see it in action. These are the levels used in our book. Some sources will just group these first four together as the chemical level. Here at organelle and cell, we get into, and tissue, we're still microscopic, but it's things we're capable of seeing because we have tools that can magnify it enough. Organs, those we can usually see with the naked eye. Organ systems make up significant portions of the body. The whole body is called an organism. So each individual living thing is an organism. So to take a little look at each level, the smallest is subatomic particles, electrons, protons, and neutrons. So, chemical levels we'll learn more about in chapter 2. We're not going deep into the chemistry, just some essentials. That's one of the things where a lot of things in this class we're just kind of skimming, and that's one of them. Atoms, often shown as sort of a solar system where the orbits overlap. These are the smallest units of types of stuff or matter called elements. So anything on the periodic table is an element. The smallest piece you can get that would still have the properties of that element is an atom, which means no cutting. Same Tom as in anatomy. Subatomic particles and atoms can affect body functions, but they're too small to make life on their own. We need to get past the chemical level before we start seeing things that we really consider to be alive. Molecules are when you get groups of atoms joined together. And generally, each level is going to be, you take several of the next smaller level and put them together to make one of these. Molecules we often show as kind of a ball and stick, where each ball is an atom and the sticks are bonds holding them together. Water, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Has anyone seen this molecule before? It's a sugar. The most common to have this formula is glucose, but there are several. Molecules can be joined in groups, and we call that a macromolecule, which means large molecule. Most of them are made of repeating units. Like you'll have a piece like a sugar, and when you put a whole bunch of them together, you get a starch, which is a macromolecule. DNA and protein are some additional macromolecules. You can't really build cells without macromolecules. Moving up from chemicals, organelles, that means little organs. They are to cells what organs are to organisms. They are distinctive structures that each have a particular function to carry out. The organelles shown on, oops, I didn't do what I thought it did. I thought there was a pointer on here, I guess not. A little organelle shown at the top is something called a mitochondria. Its job is to make energy in the cell. Other organelles will show up as distinct structures. This cell is kind of stylized, but each of those little dots and sticks is a type of organelle. A cell is the smallest thing that we consider alive. You can have a whole organism that's just one cell, microscopic things like amoebas. Someone like us is made of trillions of cells, and there are some different cell types like muscle cells, skin cells, nerve cells, and so on. These two levels we'll look at in chapter 3. Tissues, groups of cells working together, we look at in chapter 5. This is anywhere you've got cells together carrying out a common function. Things like cartilage or bone, epithelial tissues which form sheaths, such as your skin. When you get groups of tissues working together, that's an organ. Most of what you tend to think of as an organ is kind of compact in shape, like a stomach or a heart. Your skin is also an organ. It's really spread out, but it does have multiple tissues in it that work together, so it counts as an organ. Each muscle or bone is also an organ. Does anyone know what the clavicle is? Yep, she's pointing to it. It's your collarbone. That's the scientific term for it. That would be an organ on its own. Every organ is going to have a specific function in the body. Organ systems are when you get groups of organs with a related function. Most of the time, an organ system is going to be connected as well. Your digestive system is one continuous tube from your mouth to your anus with some glands attached on the sides that secrete things that help you digest. Your nervous system, kind of a network of wires that send messages around to and from your brain. Muscular system, when you draw it out like this, it's kind of covering the whole body. The one exception that's not all connected is the endocrine system, which produces hormones. Those glands are scattered around through your head, neck, and trunk. They're not connected to each other, but they're considered a system because they have related functions. And then the organism, the entire living being, would have multiple organ systems in it. All of your pets, your plants, your cells are organisms. Any questions on levels of organization? Next thing is characteristics of life. How we determine if something is alive. This is not a kind of universally accepted decision. Different textbooks will have similar but not identical listings. So we're going with our textbook's list. It has 10 things that life does. In the book, it goes through them as nouns. Here I put verbs. So living things move, or they exhibit movement. We'll go through each of these individually, so don't worry about writing down 10 words right now. Movement, not necessarily the whole organism, and not necessarily moving at a rate that you can see. Like, you put a plant in the window, you can't watch it turn its leaves. But if you come back later, you'll see that it has.